These are the 3 scale shapes I use every single time I pick up my guitar. So let's get started with shape number 1. The first shape is going to look like this. Now you may have noticed that that looks very similar to the standard minor pentatonic scale shape, which is likely the very first scale that you ever learned on the guitar. And that's because it basically is. We're using that as a foundation for this first shape. So you'd probably recognize this. Right? That would be an A minor pentatonic scale. And what we're doing is we're just adding these extra notes. And what we're really doing is we're taking a pentatonic scale, which is a 5-note scale, and we are turning it back into a major or minor scale, which is a 7-note scale. So if I were playing, it's A minor pentatonic, so if I played an A minor scale instead of, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the minor pentatonic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? So we've added those 2 extra notes back in. And that gives us a complete minor scale, an A minor scale, because we're starting on the A minor note. However, when we continue through that scale, we're able to completely fill it out. And essentially what we're also giving ourselves access to is the relative major scale. So A minor's relative major key is C major. So if I were to start this scale, let's say from this note, our C note, and play the exact same notes, not the same shape, the same notes, we would have a major scale in there as well. So what that means is this entire shape is covering both our major and minor scales, basically showing us every single allowable note that we can play within this key of A minor or C major. And this right here is the very start of our home bass, something I've talked about in other lessons, which essentially gives you a comfortable place to play no matter what key you're in, right? Because you can play that major minor scale shape that I just showed you in any key just by sliding it up and down the fretboard. The shape itself doesn't change. Now obviously we're limiting ourselves to a very small portion of the fretboard, and that's because we're just starting this idea of the home bass. We're going to expand it out into other scale shapes that are also from the same key and are also connected. So the next one that I want you to try, it's going to be in the same key, and it's going to be starting from the 7th fret. Now, if you look closely, you can see that this back part of this second scale shape, it's actually the exact same notes as the front part of our first scale shape. So they're literally connected, right? They're right on top of one another. And even though the shapes look different, we're actually playing the same groups of notes. So when I play a major scale shape back here, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. In that first position that I showed you, well, exact same scale, but now we're inside of this other scale shape. That means we have access to our A minor scale in here as well. But what we've essentially done is rather than being stuck in that first position, we've now expanded ourselves out and given ourselves a second position to work with. Now at this point, I don't want you thinking so much about playing them connected. I want you to think about them more as individual shapes that are connected. And then in a future lesson, we're going to talk about how to actually tie them together in like a smooth and interesting way. But for now, take it one shape at a time. So if it was your first time seeing shape number 1, really practice that, get that completely under your fingers, then move on to shape number 2 and really work on that second shape. It's important to note that the layout of these shapes are actually more for you to be able to access everything and less for you to be able to like run through the scale really quick, because there are spots where there are only 2 notes on a string and then the rest are 3, which can make it really hard to play quickly because it's going to mess up like the way you alternate pick through them. These shapes are more about giving you something to work with for improvising, right? Like improvising a guitar solo or even like writing your own guitar licks and riffs to to original songs or just jamming along to a song. So think about it less as a technical thing and more as like a mental thing. So you're probably assuming that shape number 3, we continue up the fretboard, right? Well, that's not what I want to do here. So if we go back to position 1, what we've essentially done, if we're going to go with the whole home base terminology, is we've built our home and then we've built, let's say, like a front yard, right? Well, rather than extending our front yard up the fretboard, which we can do eventually when we get there, I actually prefer to work on my backyard. So we're going to put a shape behind that shape number 1. And you'll sometimes see this considered like position 5, right? Because it would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, which would essentially be here before you get back to the beginning and complete the octave. But that doesn't really matter. But if you want, you can remember it as position 5. And that shape is going to look like this. Once again, when you look closely at the shapes, you can see that the front of this shape is the exact same as the back of our first shape, shape number 1. And once again, if I were to start this on maybe this C note, right, at this point, actually, I can show you the minor scale that's in there as well. Now, I can't really start on this note when I'm up here, but just for illustration's sake. And technically, I could start from the octave up. So again, you're gaining access to the same notes, but now it's spread even further, right? So now instead of just this little area, you've also got all the way up here, and you've got down below as well. All of the notes in each of these shapes is a diatonic note inside of the key that we're playing in. So when we're playing in A minor or C major, which, right, they're the exact same key, they're just relative major and minor keys, every single one of these notes is allowed. They're all gonna sound good over pretty much every chord inside the key. So what is the actual practical use of these scale shapes? Well, for me, I see them as kind of like a roadmap for everything I'm allowed to play. So when I have a chord progression in this key, which is A minor or C major, right? I have access to all of these notes that I can just play around with and try coming up with my own melodies. I know that as long as I'm hitting one of the actual notes inside this big shape, that I'm gonna be safe, and it's gonna at least work. The great thing about this big connected scale shape is that once you've learned those shapes and how they're connected in one position, you know it in every single key. So we just worked on it in A minor / C major, but I could just take the whole thing and scooch it up 2 frets. None of the shapes are gonna change. But now I would be in a new key. And in this case, we would have gone up 2 frets into the key of B minor / D major. An easy way to know is just to look that shape number 1, where your pointer finger lands on that low E string, that's our relative minor key, so that's a B note. And where our pinky is, that is our relative major key. So in this case, it would be a D note. So if our position 1, our scale shape number 1, is sitting here, well, we know it's B minor or D major. And again, all those shapes are connected and they don't change. Once again, you're giving yourself access to all of those allowable notes from inside the key to improvise with, or write with, or jam along to a song with. Every single time I sit down to be creative on the guitar, this is always my starting point. So when I'm practicing, when I'm working on original material, any of that stuff, this is always where everything starts. It's my home base, it's where I'm comfortable. Now for me, I've built this out so that it covers the entire fretboard. So no matter what position I'm in, I can cover everything all the way, which makes sense, right? Because you just kind of keep building out that front yard and backyard. But that's really not something you need to rush to, because it doesn't become that much more useful, because again, you're accessing just the same groups of notes. So really, if you just want to start with position 1, there's still a ton for you to work with. Before we talk about next steps, I just want to reiterate how important it is to learn these scale shapes as individual shapes first. Don't try and do some big connected thing right off the bat. Take it in little bite-sized chunks. So shape number 1, shape number 2, and then move into that position 5, which is shape number 3. Once you get all that stuff ironed out, figured out, you feel comfortable with it, you'll be ready to move on to tying those shapes together in a musical way, which I cover in my video about building a home base. In that lesson, I also cover how to expand even further and also how to find the chord shapes that live inside of our home base. So that video will be up on the screen for you now if you want to check it out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.